Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Skybound Capital's podcast series Under the Macroscope. And it's been quite some time since we've had Skybound's Chief Investment Officer, Theodore Shu, on the podcast. Theo, great to have you back on a quite significant day for the inhabitants and the residents of the city where you are based, Shanghai, and the broader Chinese community. There's been quite a dramatic lifting of COVID restrictions, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we start, perhaps you could give us a sense of what the last 2.5 months have looked like in terms of the Chinese lockdown.
Sure. A lot of people have heard about the Chinese lockdown and probably reading the news about things in Shanghai, but actually the lockdown was definitely far beyond just Shanghai. Shanghai has a population of about 25 million people, which is a very small percentage of Chinese population. But based on our estimate, more than 10% of Chinese population in the past 2 months were in a somewhat type of lockdown. And most of those lockdowns were very strict, full-scale lockdown where people are not allowed to step out of their houses. They're not allowed to go anywhere. They basically are ordered to stay indoor the whole time. And in the case of Shanghai, it's as strict as that. So basically the entire 25 million people were ordered to stay in for an entire 2 months since the beginning of April. But again, that is really just the entire population. A big portion of that 25 million people were starting the lockdown much earlier. So they started roughly early March. So many people have been in lockdown for the past 3 months where they couldn't do anything outside of their place.
Now, as we progress the podcast, we're going to encourage our listeners, our viewers to get in touch and pose any specific questions they might have to you, Theo, which you'd be able to answer with much greater authority than most within our network. But the sense is that there were very stringent regulations, as you've indicated, but now quite a radical exit from those restrictions. There's nothing gradual about it. You were intimating earlier before we started recording the podcast that it's only really an inability to go and sit in a restaurant that hasn't been lifted from these restrictions, but otherwise, most of your freedoms are back, if we can call them that. Is this a change of heart, do you think, in terms of what's become known as the zero COVID policy?
I think it's not an explicit change of heart as yet, but it does imply or give people some hope for the following quarters that there might be a change in the zero COVID policy. And you're absolutely right. The lifting of the lockdown in Shanghai today is coming as a surprise in terms of its scale, because a lot of people, particularly investors, were expecting a gradual process where your freedom will be given back in a phased progress. But instead, we are actually enjoying our free day right now, right today. And this is not just confined to Shanghai. As I just mentioned, a big population in the entire China was also in kind of lockdown in the past 2 months. So similarly, many parts of Beijing, the capital, also saw their lockdowns being lifted today. So this is quite a surprise to market participants, and also quite a abrupt shift from the very strict zero COVID policy. I think the government is definitely not going to say out loud that they are giving up the zero COVID policy now, just in the same way that they're not making any big announcement that they are lifting the lockdowns. Yeah. They basically just let people to go out, but they didn't really let you know that what you can do or what you can't do. It just people found out when they're out that they can pretty much do everything. Frankly, I don't think there will be anything explicit in the next a few quarters prior to the party congress in October, November. But things are taking place in between and changes are taking place.
Theo, you mentioned surprise for the investment community. I'm assuming, perhaps incorrectly, that it's pleasant surprise. And perhaps you could reflect on the impact of this easing of restrictions on China's economy. What sort of rebound can we expect given what's happened this week?
Sure. You are right that it is a pleasant surprise. The easing will relieve a lot of the businesses in terms of their normal business activities, because they really were stuck in a situation where many businesses were about to die. We are no longer talking about bankruptcies, etc. Literally, businesses are disappearing overnight simply because they can no longer sustain. They don't have people working there. They don't really have either. Therefore, in that regard, I think it really is a big relief to all businesses overall. Are we going to see a very sharp rebound of business activities in China? I suspect no, because once businesses are in such distress, it's just almost impossible that they can be revived overnight. So that's number one. And number two, I think it's the loss of confidence. It's the loss of confidence. It's the voting of confidence by not only just the foreign investors, foreign expats who live in China now. We are seeing a lot of people depart China in the past few months. A lot of people were literally forced out of China, and mainland Chinese, they can no longer easily apply for passports either. So a lot of those measures were really laying pressure on overall economy, and that pressure is not going away immediately after the lockdown is lifted. But with that said, we are seeing definitely rebounds of the economic growth and everything. It will be taking place slowly, and as I said, we don't foresee any material change in the following 2 quarters. Frankly, I do anticipate the entire country to be in a standstill for at least a few more months, again, before the party congress.
And Theo, it's impossible to ignore the additional challenge, constraint, call it what you like, which we've experienced globally, of inflation, rampant inflation in many cases. You've been talking about north of 8% CPI being reported in Europe. What is this additional challenge causing in the Chinese economy? What are the implications for China specifically here?
I think China is in a very, very difficult position now because it is struggling the dilemma of having all its main clients experiencing this big inflation, but it itself is not seeing inflation at all. So, but at the same time, Chinese monetary policy is following closely with the US, with the rest of the developed markets. So now what China has to cope with really is, okay, your clients are under pressure and they are trying to pass on that pressure to you, make sure that you don't hike your prices too quickly, too often. But at the same time, China is seeing all these imported pressure from the upstream, from the materials that it is buying. It really is making it very difficult for Chinese businesses because, again, as I said, they are stuck in the middle. And at the same time, the Chinese central bank can do nothing. A lot of investors are expecting, okay, now that China is not experiencing that much of inflation, and China still has relatively kind of good budget and everything, can China just ease up? Can China just jump on a QE so that it can stimulate its own economy? The quick answer is no. China cannot. China is actually very much constrained by many other factors, like how the provincial governments are doing in general in terms of their financial standing, as well as how big a threat a capital flight might have on the country. The Chinese currency has been very strong in the past few years, but it depreciated by over 10% just within weeks, in the past few weeks. So we are seeing a tremendous pressure on the Chinese government and also the Chinese central bank, which is also stuck in this position where it can not really jump on anything too material to boost the economy, but at the same time, it is under pressure from the government that it needs to do something to boost the economy. Therefore, I think globally, investors will see gradually many measures being announced in China. But my point is, do not expect any of those measures, be it fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus, to be actually meaningful or effective to the extent that the Chinese economy will suddenly get this big boost and it will fire back to the normal level. No, I don't think that will be the case. Chinese economy will be under pressure for the rest of the year.
Yeah, so as always, it remains a very delicate balancing act for policymakers. On the subject of policy, Theo, while you have been in this extended lockdown, war has raged on between Russia and Ukraine. It's very hard for people to gain real clarity on where China stands on this conflict. What is their view? Are China ultimately going to be subjected to similar sanction risks if they don't come out against Russia? There's a lot of moving parts here.
Sure. I mean, speaking of China's stance on this Russia move, I think I will actually quote US strategy towards China, particularly towards the China-Taiwan relationship for the past few decades. So the summary of the US strategy is called strategic ambiguity. And I think that's exactly what China was doing when it was facing this Russia-Ukraine crisis. China, as many people know, are kind of bonded with Russia on many fronts. China is also very close to Russia, even militarily. And this is exactly why there was speculation that China might intervene into that war, even in a physical way. But that's not going to happen. I think we discussed this before. Overall, China will try to stay neutral. But that neutrality is not necessarily clear cut. It's not black and white. It's more the strategic ambiguity that I was alluding to. China cannot afford to be entirely isolated, because currently China stays quite far from the West. And if China suddenly loses its last friends, then China will be really purely isolated. So that's a no-go for China. But the other thing is, I think China understands very clearly that there's no future with a closer relationship with Russia either. So it is definitely in China's better interests to be aligning itself closer to the West. But then the question is how? And the Russian crisis now definitely is a big warning call to China. China now understands it clearly, the types of risks, the types of sanctions it might face if it miscalculates, if it makes a wrong move, politically or militarily. So that is good. That is good in the sense that China understands the outcomes, and China will try its best to avoid such consequences. But
the bigger question really, as you said, is how China is moving forward. How is China aligning itself closer to the real friends in a way? I think people globally do not necessarily see such a relationship between, for example, China and Europe or China and US as friends. But if you look back into the history, China was really very friendly, and it was the other way around too. So it was very bilateral and mutual. I think it is possible that China can return back to that better status than where it is in right now. But in the very, very short term, I think politics still trumps everything else. Again, I go back to my point on the party congress. In the very short term, the focus will be on that, and there will be no material change or moves, just rest assured. So I don't think China will take any drastic moves in the following month at all.
It's a delicate position. Some would argue it's fragile. What you've outlined just on this podcast are myriad challenges facing the Chinese leadership, the Chinese economy, all at the same time. It's almost like a perfect storm. And you see some commentary suggesting that given all these challenges, that China, at least in the near term, may have become or is heading towards being uninvestable. Do you see it that way, Theo?
We will never call China uninvestable simply because of its market depth and the number of people there. I mean, let me give you a worst case scenario. Say China wages a war, China loses the war, there is a regime change in China, but the country will not be wiped out from the world. If you're looking at live videos from Kiev in Ukraine today, people are walking on the street. Life is almost back to normal. I mean, the businesses are still going on. That will be the case with China too. So as long as China remains a big country, there are that many people in China, it will always present investment opportunities, business opportunities. It will always be investable. However, as investors looking at China, tracking the regime shifts going on in China now, I think for investors, they need to be fully aware of the shifts and all of the directions of these shifts, where they are going to see future investment opportunities are likely to be very, very different from what they were used to. I mean, I think even a layman investor would probably recall names like Alibaba, Tencent, etc. Those are household names, and those companies delivered tremendous return for investors over the past decade. But what I'm saying is going forward, it will be different. It will be different because China is in a different phase of its growth, and the political aspects in China are also nurturing further growth of some other sectors, some other businesses. And there will always be new opportunities, and China will remain investable.
Well, Theo, we look forward to exploring some of those new opportunities with you, because today, as always, just so wonderful to have your very keen insight from somebody who has their feet on the ground and can unpack some of the stories and assess their truth or otherwise within China. But for now, we wish you well, Theo, and I'm sure you're just so eager to get out and go and work in an office and go to a grocery store, which has been very tricky for you for the last 2 months and beyond. So as always, thank you for your insights. We look forward to your next appearance on the podcast series. Under the Macroscope is available on Apple, on Spotify, on the Google podcast platform for Android. And you can download past editions of Under the Macroscope at Skybound Capital's website, which is www.skyboundcapital.com. And as always, we do encourage you to get in touch. We enjoy the feedback. We enjoy the questions as members of Skybound Capital's research team, from Theo in Shanghai, from Jabir in London. We have research team members all around the globe, and we would love to get your insights, even some suggestions for podcast topics that may be of interest to you. So get those queries, those questions, those suggestions coming in. Thank you for being on the podcast once again. And until next time on Under the Macroscope, cheerio.